Certainly when we look at the supply and demand situation, how soybeans are marketed and priced, and those factors that can influence where prices go in the future, that coupled with the production information that we have a fairly decent understanding of where revenue, or what kind of revenue generating ability that we can have through soybean production. But in order to determine the profitability of soybean production here in Louisiana, we need to look at the cost of production side of it. And so what we'll do here now is look at those costs of production, see how those have changed over the last several years, and give some insight in terms of where those may go in the future. Like most other commodities, production costs have increased pretty substantially over the last several years. Not only because we've seen increases in input costs, like seed costs have gone up, insecticides have gone up, herbicides have gone up, fuel, repair and maintenance have gone up. But I think when you look at, in the case of soybeans in particular, the amount of management that producers are doing now versus 20 years ago is much more intense. So we would expect to see the cost of production increase, and we certainly have. Back in the 1997, 2000, when I first started working for the LSU AgCenter, average soybean cost per acre was somewhere around $90 to $120 an acre. That was on average what, if you go throughout Louisiana, that's about what producers were spending per acre in direct cost to produce soybeans. Now we're well over $300 in most cases, or in many cases, in terms of what producers are spending per acre on soybean production. We've seen an increased use of irrigation. Certainly, as we've intensified the management of soybeans, applying more herbicide, applying more fungicide, more insecticide, to do a better job of managing the insects and the pests that we see. We've also seen an increase in irrigation cost, an increase in irrigation use over the last 10 to 15 years or so. The last topic that I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit in terms of land rent for soybeans. The vast majority of our producers, not only soybeans, but most of our row crop producers, vast majority have at least portion of their total farm that is rented land. And when you look at that rent, that is certainly a significant cost of production for our producers. For soybeans, still historically and still today, share rental arrangements are the most common. And what I mean by share rental arrangements, producer provides a share of the crop that he produces to the landlord as payment for the rent. So instead of the producer giving the landlord a check at the end of the year, what the producer does is gives him a certain amount of those soybeans that he produced. The landlord can therefore go and sell those soybeans, and whatever he sells those soybeans for is his rent for the land. That is still, I think, the most predominant rental arrangement that we have. We do have, over the last couple of years, a heavier interest in cash rents, and those are really all over the board. Cash rents range specifically for soybean production, somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $75 an acre, where our share rent arrangements are about 15 to 20% of the crop. So again, both of those are significant components to what it costs to grow an acre of soybeans here in Louisiana. This table is the budgets that the LSU AgCenter develop each and every year. As you can see here, we've got 6 different budgets for dry land, irrigated, and by different areas of the state for soybean production. And actually we have another one that's not included here, which would be a wheat and soybean double crop situation. But when we're looking at soybeans as a single or a monocrop, single crop, you can see here for 2013, we averaged somewhere in the low $300 to the mid $300 per acre in direct cost in the central and northern part of the state. Southwest Louisiana, still a little bit different production practices there. They can get by a little bit cheaper. They don't. Most of it is predominantly non-irrigated in Southwest Louisiana, but still, you're looking at an average cost there of about $280, $290 an acre. Below that, going to give you some break-even price levels for soybeans at those costs of production. And you can see here, when you look at particularly our average yield over the last several years has been probably around 40 bushels, a little bit better than 40 bushels. And you can see here that across those different categories that we're looking at a break-even price of from $7 to about $9 a bushel. And we're looking at prices right now that have been in the $12 to $13 range. So you're looking at a per bushel net return in 2013 of somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 a bushel, which is just extremely, extremely strong, and why we have seen a growing interest in soybean production here in Louisiana. Kind of a breakdown in terms of those costs. You look at the cost of production. Seed and pest management are primarily the major factors in terms of cost of production. You look at seed, about 16% of total cost is in seed. When you look at fungicide, herbicide, and insecticide combined together, you're looking at another 35 or 36%. So when you add those two together, you're about half of total production costs come from seed and pest management, particularly when you add in harvest aids and other chemical use at the end of the year. Fertilizer and lime, you see here, is a relatively large category, about 22%. And this is one that when we build our budgets, we assume that producers are going to make these fertilizer applications. This is probably one that is more varied from producer to producer. We've got some producers that do fertilize soybeans each and every year, and in those cases, that their cost would be expected to be in line with what we have there. And in other cases, we've got producers that have not and probably won't apply fertilizer to soybean production, and so their cost of production are going to be quite a bit lower than what our budgets would estimate. Because when you look at our fertilizer and lime application, that's about $70 an acre in 2013. So if you take that off across the board, you're looking at per acre cost somewhere in the neighborhood of the low to mid $200 an acre range without fertilizer applications. This next one is a breakdown of your estimated soybean production. This is the first one was non-irrigated. This is irrigated, and again, what you see happening here is that irrigation expenses make up about 12% of the total cost of production here. About $44 an acre is what we estimate irrigation on average to cost for a typical soybean operation. So we see a pretty significant increase in our total cost per acre when we do irrigate. The question becomes is, do we see enough of a yield response to justify that increased cost in irrigation? And we'll talk about that here in a second or two. What this this next table shows is the budgets that we showed you earlier, the estimated cost that we showed you earlier. Each one of those is based off of a certain set of assumptions that we generate to estimate our per acre costs. And when you look at particularly the central and northern part of the state, those activities that we assumed are pretty standard through the central and the northern part of the state in terms of soybean production. We start off with our fall activities, which is going to be primarily that fertilizer application in the fall and some fall tillage. When you look at those combined together, we spend about $87 an acre before we plant the first seed of soybeans through the fall. Once we get into the spring, we'll have a spring burn down application, going in, killing those weeds, getting them ready, that seedbed ready for planting. You can see here our activities or our assumptions have been Roundup, Valor, and 2,4-D are the three chemicals or herbicides that are used or assumed to be used in that burn down application, and that costs about $22 an acre. We get into planting. Planting costs about $57 to $58 an acre when you talk about the cost of the equipment plus the cost of the seed. And then we have a herbicide, insecticide, and fungicide programs. 2 applications of herbicides in addition to the spring burn down with a cost of about $50 an acre. 3 insecticide applications, and those are going to be primarily for stink bug control. Some other control as well, but stink bug control has been and historically will probably continue to be the biggest, the most important pest affecting our soybean production. But 3 applications of insecticide at a cost of about $36 an acre, and then fungicide applications. 2 of those at a cost of about $33 an acre. So when you look at those those combined, we have some significant costs there. A harvest day, this is an activity that's been relatively new to our budgets. This is an activity that over the last 4 or 5 years we've seen a growing number of producers applying harvest aids, allowing those soybeans to be harvested earlier, primarily a function of trying to get soybeans out of the ground and harvested before we get into some more severe, or get the potential for some more severe weather conditions. So that application is about $12 an acre. Our harvest costs in terms of the machinery, fuel, repair, and maintenance about $8 to $9 an acre. Hauling cost, in our budgets we just assume we assume a custom haul situation where you would hire someone, or the producer would hire someone to come out there and haul those soybeans to an elevator. That's about $14 an acre. And then finally our irrigation costs, again, of $44 an acre. You add all those, and so we have, based on those assumptions, or based on those activities, we have a total cost of production there of about $360, $364 an acre for irrigated soybean production. Take a little bit better breakdown of that irrigation cost. As I mentioned here, we had earlier, we have about $44 an acre in terms of our irrigation costs. Those are based upon roughly 3 applications or 3 irrigations in a year, applying roughly about 3 acre inches of water per application. So obviously in a relatively rainy season, our irrigation cost of production would go down from what these numbers would suggest, where we don't have to make those many applications. Obviously in a more drought type situation where we have to make 4, 5, 6 irrigations, we would expect to see our per acre cost for irrigation increase pretty substantially. But on average, typically we're looking at about 3 irrigations per year. You look at it, $43 an acre, $44 an acre, and if you break it down on a per irrigation or a per application time, we're looking at about $15 each time you crank the well or crank the pump to irrigate an acre of soybeans. So what kind of yield response do we need to see to cover those costs, for that to be a benefit to us? And you can see here, particularly over the last several years, where we've had soybean prices at and well above $10 a bushel, we're looking at only having to have a yield response of 3 to 4 bushels an acre. And we've seen that particularly in very dry conditions. But obviously, as we see the prices go higher, the amount of bushels that we need in response to irrigation goes down as prices go higher. And I think because of those high soybean prices that we've had, we've seen much more interest in terms of our total amount of acres that we are irrigating here in Louisiana. But 3 to 4, and at some of the lower prices, as much as 5 bushels needed to cover those costs. And we've seen that in some of our verification programs, where we've seen yield responses being as close to 10 bushels an acre, particularly when we had a very, very dry season. And this is a breakdown of those irrigation costs. This is furrow irrigation. So basically, we have a well, we have polypipe, and we water the middles of the rows. The majority of the cost associated with that is going to be in fuel. Our budgets are based on diesel fuel engines. We've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of electric motors that are used in irrigation systems. Those have been, from an operational standpoint, for how much it costs to run that particular piece of equipment, has been a lot cheaper over the last several years, given the high fuel costs, given that we've seen diesel prices in excess of $3 a gallon. So we can see a little bit of cost savings in our irrigation with some of the electric motors, and as well as if you're looking at surface irrigation versus well irrigation. And these budgets are based on a deep water well, pumping water into the soybeans. If we change with a diesel motor, if we change that to electric motor, we could see some cost savings typically. And certainly if we go from a deep water well to irrigating from surface water, from a river or a stream, a bayou, what have you, then we can also see those costs go down substantially as well.